So my husband and Jim and I like to travel, and we've done a lot of it this year. And among the places we visited were the sites of some of the camps where Japanese Americans were incarcerated during World War II. We went to Jerome, Arkansas, Rower, Arkansas, Manzanar, California, Poston, Arizona, Crystal City, Texas, and Gila, Arizona. Some of these trips were for organized events that were specifically called pilgrimages. Others did not have that title. But I think that all of our visits to these historic sites were, in fact, pilgrimages. What is a pilgrimage? Here's one definition: a journey in which a person goes in search of new or expanded meaning about the self, others, nature, or a higher good. Pilgrimages are a part of many religious traditions, including Buddhism. Traditional Buddhist pilgrimages include visits to Bodh Gaya, India, where Shakyamuni attained enlightenment, and Sarnath, where he delivered his first sermon. In Japan, there is the famous Shikoku 88 Temple pilgrimage of Shingon Buddhism. So pilgrimage, then, is a journey with a higher purpose, often spiritual in nature, to a place of special significance. Now, it might seem unusual, kind of an odd hobby, that we chose to visit places with tragic pasts, but my initial motivation for visiting these sites was historical. I'm a genealogist and a family historian, an amateur genealogist. And as a Sensei, a third-generation Japanese American, I wanted to learn more about my family's story. My mother, her parents, and her siblings were among the 120,000 Americans of Japanese ancestry who were removed from their homes on the West Coast and incarcerated in isolated camps during World War II. I wanted to see with my own eyes the places where my family, and others like them, spent those years. I wanted to educate myself about the history and get a feel for what they experienced. I knew that these places would have emotional resonance, but I wasn't prepared for their impact. Ultimately, these visits became more than history lessons or research opportunities. For me, they were transformative journeys. They took on a spiritual significance. They became my pilgrimages. At first, my interest was focused more on my own family history. My mother and her family were among the 18,000 people incarcerated at Poston, Arizona. I wanted to see where they lived. I wanted to understand what their daily lives might have been like. I wanted to put the facts that I did know into a physical setting. I wanted to be able to imagine what it would have been like. But I think my deeper yearning, if I was honest with myself, was a desire to understand the places and events that shaped my mother's life. I don't always understand the kind of person that my mother is, and I wanted to learn what made her into the person that she is, and by extension, how did that affect who I am? Uh-oh. Okay, so we went to Poston, and I saw the ruins of the school that my mother attended, Poston 1 Elementary School. I felt the burning sun and the 100-degree plus desert heat, and thought about what it would be like to live there for 3 years. My shoes, as you can see, were coated with the dust that is my mother's strongest memory of Poston. Dust that penetrated into my hair, that stung my eyes when the wind kicked up, and that left a gritty feeling in my throat. And this was when I was walking around in it for 45 minutes, not for 3 years. I saw this field where once stood a barrack where my mom and the other 5 members of her family lived in a 24 by 20 foot room. Standing on that ground and hearing the experiences of others who lived there gave me much more insight into my mother's life and her psyche. I could understand the silence of my family members and others like them who for decades kept their memories and their pain largely buried. We went to other camps in addition to Poston, with each place giving me a fuller understanding of the historical background, the conditions endured by those who live there, and the unique aspects of each camp. It is one thing to read books about the internment camps or to look at historical photographs of them. It is quite another to visit the places themselves, to make your way to their locations in isolated areas of the United States, to be surrounded by the desolate landscapes, to stand on the same ground as those who were forced to live there. This is Manzanar, California, in April. And in Manzanar, even in April, I could see snow on the peaks of the eastern Sierras, rising up behind the campsite, even as the blazing heat beat down upon my head. At Rower and Jerome, we drove into the humid, swamping terrain of the Arkansas Delta, and in a steady rain, squelched through the mud in our soggy shoes. At these places, I learned a lot from the on-site displays that were frequently there that explained the history, and by attending panels and workshops that were put on to educate those of us who were gathered there. But I learned even more by listening to those who lived through the experience, like this 92-year-old woman, Kate Assed, at the Crystal City Pilgrimage in Texas. She's actually somebody who grew up not far from here in the Imperial Valley of California. And she was in Crystal City because she told me her father was arrested in the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor because he was considered suspicious for being a Japanese school teacher. Later on, she and her mother, who were initially in the camp in Poston, Arizona, were sent to Crystal City to be with their father and husband. I learned about the loss of homes, businesses, property, community. I heard about family separation from people who were children when their fathers were arrested and taken away, and sometimes not seen again for years. I heard about heat, cold, dust, mud, snow, the loss of freedom, the lack of privacy, the breakdown of family life. I learned things that I'd never heard of before, such as the fate of the Japanese Latin Americans who were essentially kidnapped from Peru and other countries and sent to Crystal City to be used as hostages. These are all things that I'd mostly read about before, certainly, and had even seen in documentaries. But it's one thing to read or view from the comfort of my home, and it's altogether different to stand on the ground where people actually lived, loved, suffered, and died. It is different when you hear from those who actually lived those experiences. As I stood there and imagined what it was like for the people incarcerated in these places, I felt many emotions, including pain, sorrow, anger, hurt, and fear. These are feelings that I think we tend to avoid or run away from in our ordinary lives. But at the camp gatherings, we had memorial services, music, multi-generational discussion groups, and the discovery of connections with people we were meeting for the first time. All of these work to break down the emotional barriers and unlock feelings. Being in those settings, separated from my everyday life and surroundings, and sharing that experience with other people who were feeling some of the same emotions, gave me permission to feel my feelings, to recognize them, to examine them, and to understand them. And I would say that was really a healing process. Once I could acknowledge those feelings in myself, I could feel compassion, and not only for myself, for my mother, for my family, for my community, but a compassion that could radiate beyond me to encompass a larger reality. Going hand in hand with that compassion was, I think, a sense of interconnectedness. I connected with the history that I was learning, and that feeling of connection expanded to encompass not only my family, not just other Japanese Americans, but all who have suffered and are suffering. I could see that loss and pain were not only a Japanese American story. At Poston and Gila, I heard the stories of the Native Americans upon whose land these camps were built against their wishes, part of a long history of genocide and dispossession. In Arkansas, I learned about what life was like for black and white alike in the Jim Crow South during World War II, the poorest part of a poor state. Last weekend, Professor Jeff Wilson gave a seminar at OCBC, and I know he gave one here also at Vista, entitled Refugee Shinran, in which he said that we live in what he called the age of the refugee, a time where there are countless people around the world facing forced migration, homelessness, incarceration, and displacement. At Crystal City, I met and heard Julian Saporiti, a singer-songwriter and scholar whose mother was a refugee from Vietnam, somebody with no Japanese-American background, but who saw in his visit to Heart Mountain and other incarceration sites a commonality with the refugee experience of his mother and his family, and who has made it his life's work to translate that into song and scholarship. I heard the words of Libya Yamamoto, a Japanese Latin American who was 7 years old when her father was taken away from her and sent to the United States to be used as a hostage. She and her family were later sent to Crystal City, Texas, to join him, and she talked very movingly and very publicly about how she identified with the experiences of children at the border who were being separated from their parents and connecting that to the experience that she went through so many years ago. Visiting these Japanese American incarceration sites connected the dots between past and present. And from my recognition of the shared suffering, I also saw our shared humanity and our oneness. And I think that really made me understand in a deeper way the loving kindness metta meditation that we sometimes recite. It starts with, may all beings be happy and well, may no harm or difficulties come to them, may they live in peace and harmony. And then it goes on to talk about, may I be happy and well. Then it expands to my family, my teachers, my friends, may strangers be happy and well. May no harm or difficulties come to them. May they live in peace and harmony. My enemies, may they be happy and well. May no harm or difficulties come to them. May they live in peace and harmony. And at its widest circle, it expands again to, may all beings be happy and well. May no harm or difficulties come to them. May they live in peace and harmony. I experienced that feeling of oneness that's expressed in the metta meditation in the religious observances that we participated in as well. At all of these sites, we had the opportunity to carry out acts of reverence and remembrance, offering incense, prayer, flowers, origami cranes. At interfaith memorial services at Manzanar and Crystal City, I could see people of different religious traditions and diverse backgrounds feel the significance of these places and the spiritual meaning of the journeys that brought us together there. That is the incense and flower offering at Crystal City, Texas. Behind them, you could kind of barely see there are name cards there, and there's a card for each of the people who died while incarcerated at Crystal City, including German Americans. On the right is a shot of the cemetery in Rower, Arkansas. There is a graveyard there with a number of graves, and you could see that people have left flowers and stones to mark their visits there. At Crystal City, the service was led by a local Pentecostal Christian minister of Latino heritage, a Jodo Shinshu minister of Japanese descent, and a Zen priest of Japanese and British ancestry, Reverend Dr. Duncan Williams. At Manzanar, participants included a Muslim imam, as you could see in the middle, a Shinto priest, clergy from multiple Christian denominations, and various Buddhist traditions. As I saw these incarceration sites, I thought about how the three treasures of Buddha, the teachers, Dharma, the teachings, and Sangha, the community of believers, survived there. The teachers in the form of the ministers who continued to teach the Sangha, the Buddha Dharma. I learned that at Crystal City alone, there were 38 Buddhist ministers incarcerated there. The Dharma. We saw examples of mimeographed service books that were created in the camps. We heard about the Dharma school sessions that were taught there. We learned about the funerals that were conducted there. The Sangha. Temples were established in the assembly centers first, and then in the camps. Our Buddhist Churches of America, the umbrella organization that this temple belongs to, was established in the Topaz concentration camp in Utah in the midst of the war, and given the very optimistic name, Buddhist Churches of America. If you're wondering why some Buddhist temples in our tradition in the United States are called churches, it's because of this wartime development of the BCA and the conscious decision to choose the word churches and America to show the truly American nature of Jodo Shinshu in this country. This is the Manzanar Buddhist Church in 1944 during a snowstorm. Some of you may have read Reverend Dr. Duncan Williams' book, American Sutra, and I heard it will be a book club, Vista book club reading in February, I believe. From American Sutra, I learned how wartime incarceration gave Japanese American Buddhists an opportunity to transform their difficulties into enlightenment and spiritual liberation. As we know, the first noble truth taught by the Buddha is that life is suffering. The lotus blossom has great symbolic meaning in Buddhism. It is a beautiful flower that grows out of muddy water. The lotus symbolizes how enlightenment and liberation can grow out of the muddy water of samsara, this world of suffering. The nutrients from the muddy water enable the flower to exist. So the lotus does not blossom in spite of the dirty water. It blossoms because of it. In the same way, Japanese American Buddhists could find spiritual meaning in their suffering, knowing that every experience, no matter how difficult or tragic, can be transformed into a source of greater understanding, wisdom, and compassion. From Dr. Williams, who spoke at Crystal City, we learned of how Buddhists would celebrate Hanamatsuri without ritual implements by carving a statue of the baby Buddha from a carrot and pouring, instead of sweet tea over it, pouring sweetened coffee over the baby Buddha. And flowers were made for funerals made out of, since no flowers were available, out of toilet paper and dyed with beet juice. We read about a Buddhist minister incarcerated at Fort Livingston who used the light of the guard tower's searchlights as a means of focusing his mind for meditation. And so you could see that Buddhists, despite the difficult circumstances in which they found themselves, found ways to continue to practice their faith. At each camp we visited, I thought about the Japanese American Buddhists who maintain their religious beliefs and practice under these most difficult of circumstances. They came out of the camps having lost almost everything and started over. And incidentally, I think that the founders of this temple, Vista Buddhist Temple, probably most of them had been incarcerated at Poston, because that's where people from this area were largely sent. And so Poston is a part of the history of this temple. They came out of the camps having lost almost everything, starting over. They reestablished temples and rebuilt their sanghas. If it weren't for their courage, persistence, and sacrifice, we would not be here this morning, sitting in this beautiful temple, to hear the Dharma. A crucial aspect of a pilgrimage is that the pilgrim returns to their ordinary life, but having been changed by their journey. How did going on my pilgrimages change me? I'll just talk about a few of them. First, I think it gave me a greater understanding, respect, and gratitude for my family members, especially my mother, who went through the trauma of incarceration. I really understood where she was coming from and why she is the way she is. Second, it made me understand, appreciate, and accept the causes and conditions, for better or worse, that made me the person I am. And to understand that the circumstances, no matter how difficult or tragic they may have been, were something out of which something good could emerge. I think it also helped me transform my feelings of personal pain into compassion and a more expansive recognition of our common humanity, interdependence, and oneness. And finally, it gave me a gratitude and deep appreciation for those Jodo Shinshu Buddhists who kept the Dharma alive in America, enabling me to have the opportunity to discover and study it. And since it's Thanksgiving, it seemed a very appropriate time to say that for all of this, I am most grateful. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu.